So I'm delighted to have Emanuele Costa here to speak today about Agnesi. Emanuele is a assistant professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And before that, he earned his PhD at Birkbeck College in London. And he's published a lot on Spinoza. He's also one of the founders and organizers of VAMP, which is very popular in early modern philosophy, and a great talk series as well. So maybe you check it out. And today he's going to talk about Agnesi on women's equality. And yeah, I'm excited. We are all excited to hear your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, thanks all of you for being here at your various times in the world. And thanks particularly to Clara for allowing me to reschedule this after a big mishap last time. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of your projects at New Voices and in general with your organization. So this is a very proud moment for me. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, let me just, there you go. So is this okay? Is this working? Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna give a shorter version of a bigger paper that I am finishing up, touching up. The reason why I want to give the short version, apart from sparing you all some, boredom, is also because I would really like to have in the Q&A an honest discussion about one theme that's particularly important to me. That is, how can we apply the label of feminism to works that are, so positioned in history that the full-on label of what feminism is doesn't quite fit. So I have a whole discussion of that in the paper, but I'm not gonna talk about it today until the Q&A. All right, so thanks again, and let me start. So a significant debate regarding women's education and their role in liberal arts and pure science both emerged in the context of what's been called the Catholic Enlightenment, as you all know. Maria Gaetana Agnesi, born 1718, died 1799, is a lesser known figure among the defenders of women's right to access education, to practice science as a career, and to be recognized among their male counterparts. Agnesi is mostly famous for her contribution to pure mathematics and to the popular divulgation of mathematics. However, she was also an advocate for the rights of women philosophers and scientists. While the scientific elements of her work have seen a recent rise in interest in all the various venues that entails, proto-feminists, I'm going to use this label for now, proto-feminism, they have not quite been recognized by contemporary scholarship. So in this paper, I want to do that. I want to address this particular thread of her work, emphasizing the presence of proto-feminism and its consistency throughout her production. To this end, I will analyze closely 3 texts by Agnesi. The first one is an oration that she gave in 1727. Now, if my math is not wrong, she was 9 years old when she gave this oration. And the title is Academic Oration, in which it is demonstrated that the studies of the liberal arts by the female sex are by no means inappropriate. And this is, as you all know, a very recurring theme in the early modern, I'll say in the second part of the early modern age, especially, thanks to people like von Schurman. But, I find it very impressive that a 9-year-old was already discussing this. The second one is inserted in the preface to her Propositiones Philosophicae, which she published in 1738 as the conclusion of her studies in philosophy. The third is the dedication piece of her masterpiece, the Analytical Institutions, or Istituzioni Analitiche ad uso della gioventù italiana, published in 1748. So this was a Calcos manual that was dedicated to the Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, prejudice. In the analysis of the three texts, what I will emphasize are the key elements of feminism and advocacy, which, far from being, an afterthought or an embellishment, represent a recurrent aspect of Agnesi's production. In doing so, I will also demonstrate that, as an independent element, her feminism itself was subject to growth and evolution. So the first part of the talk, I entitled it A Young Debater. Throughout the 18th century, Italy was the theater of a debate regarding the status of women in higher education and philosophical scientific learning. In 1723, the influential Accademia dei Ricovrati hosted a public debate on this topic, which sent ripples through the northern Italian aristocratic class. In particular, the debate made a strong impression on the Milanese merchant Pietro Agnesi, a socially ambitious man. His daughter, Maria Gaetana, had been recognized as a prodigy child and was particularly oriented towards liberal arts, foreign and ancient languages, and pure sciences. To stimulate his daughter, and, by the way, obtain social recognition, Agnesi organized vivacious conversazioni in his palace. On one of such occasions, in 1727, the young Maria Gaetana, at the time that was just 9, delivered an impressive oration in defense of the educational rights of women. Now, before moving to the proper analysis of this piece, let me put forward a caveat. As it's already been pointed out by some previous commentators, determining exactly how much the young Agnesi could have contributed to the composition of the piece is a complicated task, of course. It's indeed possible that she was a mere mouthpiece for the delivery of the text, but suggesting that her tutors might have helped her compose the oration in Latin of the Latin version, which is the one that she actually delivered. So there is this opinion, but as I will demonstrate in the following sections, the same themes and arguments that she presents in this early text will be consistently repeated and restated throughout her, 25 years career, showing that she had assimilated and elaborated the position that she defends in this oration. So let me just go to the text. She opens it with this impressive cry. For shame, she says. Must the womanly republic alone grow old any longer in its domestic idleness when the schools are ablaze with literary labor? Must it alone not be allowed to speak with a learned voice when the academies protest noisily and learnedly? The academic expectation of this child prodigy and her frustration at the ends of prejudice are theatrically introduced in the text from the very beginning. It is not surprising then the opinion of those who suppose that the studies of the liberal arts are unsuitable for women. Laying down the foundations of this oration, she indicates that her opposers use a threefold strategy to exclude women from higher education. The arguments of the oppressor are the following: customs, physical weakness, and the fear of a change so deep that it could break down and overturn all civil and domestic affairs. So the first one, customs have never allowed women to be educated and to publicly engage in culture. Why change? Second, prevent them from effectively engaging in scholarly activities, which are not we all know scholarly activities are hard physical work, right? Uh, Third, female minds should be busying themselves with the needle and the spindle. And this is where I took the title of my talk. These things and others of this kind are proper to women, unlike pen and paper. So what she does, she goes through each argument separately in order to disarm the oppressor. It should be noted that this first document is also the most articulated feminist argumentation that she produced, so we should definitely analyze it with attention. So, okay. The first argument against equality is represented by the idea that customs have never allowed women to be educated and to publicly engage in culture. In the mind of the oppressor, this idea is so entrenched that they claim it to be always maintained since the birth of mankind and preserved by inviolable religion. For someone as learned as the young Agnesi, however, this argument is very easy to dismiss. He proceeds to cite ancient historical examples, the Hypatia, etc., to which she adds the teachings of early church fathers, such as Origen and Jerome. Agnesi then points out to the many women learned in every kind of knowledge who have flourished in every age, and she goes on and gives a fairly extensive list. Her rebuttal demonstrates that the historic or religious customs that prevent women to access education are little more than fiction and do not possess the strength that posers assign them. The second argument faced by Agnesi is the allegation that women's soft condition and the slight composition of their limbs prevent them from effectively engaging in scholarly activities. The rebuttal of this ridiculous objection, actually what it entails is that she recurs to a pretty advanced understanding of Cartesian philosophy of mind. So she goes the same kind of route that someone like Estelle goes, saying, we must denounce those who situate the dignity of mankind in its outer appearance, as if the more charming beauty did not lie beneath the shell of the limbs. So she's making reference to the Cartesian debate regarding the separation of mind and body. And the thesis according to which the mind is not the same substance as the body of Cartesian formulation was at that time employed by feminist writers to defend the equality of women's intellects. Think about Pauline de Labarre. So the argument rests on mind-body separation to demonstrate that the mind could have no sex or gender, which are attributes belonging to the body. Thus, any non-gendered mind is capable of the same activities. And what I find interesting is she does take this route to feminism, and we will see later when we discuss shortly the institutions, that she's also pretty close to Descartes in some forms about the mathematics of it, about the mathematical debate between Descartes and Leibniz. Agnesi moves to defend women's against the worst accusation of their adversary, as not only harmless, but very useful in both private and public affairs. In characterizing her opposer's view, Agnesi denounces the prejudice that female minds should be busying themselves with the needle and the spindle. The objections she proposes to this view are definitely distant from contemporary ways to understand equality, as based on the claim, and this is perhaps where I kind of start agreeing with previous commentators who've said, she was probably very young and easily swayed. They rest on the claim that a learned woman would be a better companion to a husband. We can see here the intrusion in the composition of a hand that is not Agnesi, as her life trajectory justifies abhorrence for this kind of tame life. In fact, she never married, and once she concluded her career as a scholar, she went into a convent. So she was as far as possible from the concept of a husband as that would be. But I still observe that this claim sprouts from a decided conviction of equality. So she says, anyone is only human as they're wise. This call to wisdom applies to all humanity, regardless of gender, and it's therefore anti-human to prevent women to access education. They should be allowed to have the instruments to educate themselves. Failing this, they would not be human. They would be condemned to waste slowly away. So public and private utility then are guaranteed rather than destroyed by encouraging women to access higher education and fly away from these narrow straits to the contemplation of things, as she says. So through the rebuttal of this third objection, Agnesi, however, as I noted, Agnesi's feminism in this oration is still at an embryonic stage. It maintains that at least part of the utility in educating women derives from their becoming better companions. Nonetheless, I think it is important to know that the arguments put forth in the text rest on a fundamental belief in the equality of men and women as minds or as rational human beings, therefore bringing together Cartesian and Aristotelian elements. Their minds, the minds of women, being separated from the bodies through Cartesian dualism, possess the same capabilities and should be granted equal opportunities to pursue scientific and philosophical learning. As I said, this is the most articulated discussion of feminism that we have in Agnesi, but as we read her following works, we'll see the same themes kind of pop up. So, second section of the paper, a learned advocate. I'll examine the second piece produced by Agnesi, the philosophical proposition. Composed in 1738 as the concluding document of her philosophy course, the function of this text, which is in Latin, is to present Agnesi's erudition and not to offer original research. For this reason, most of this text is kind of like just rehearse of some known Cartesian and scholastic themes. But the prologue, the preface, is instead very innovative. It offers a brief history of philosophy, kind of along the lines of what Leibniz would do in some of his texts, kind of trying to understand what the history of philosophy, how the history of philosophy has developed, and what direction is it heading into. So she goes through the history of philosophy in which she mentions schools, right, rather than singular figures. She doesn't mention Aristotle, for example, but she does a few exceptions. She mentions Thales as the first philosopher, Pythagoras, Plato, and Xenocrates. Clearly, this is a testimony to her prevailing interest towards mathematics. So if this is what's happening, it's even more noteworthy. And she includes a section, Proposition 3, that's dedicated exclusively to the defense of women in science and philosophy. The section presents passages that remind one of her oration. And I did this rough translation from the Latin because this text is not published by any contemporary edition. In ancient times, no one was denying that the weaker sex excelled in all areas of philosophy. For we know that, in addition to the almost 70 most erudite women listed by Menage, at any time many others flourished who obtained the highest praise for their intellectual achievements in philosophical disciplines. Thus, nature prepared the minds of women too for all manners of teaching and erudition. For this reason, those who entirely deny them the study of the noble arts behave slightly more offensively towards women, especially for the reason that their studies would not only be damaging to private and public things alike, but on the contrary, would be very much useful. In this passage, as I'm sure you recognize, Agnesi refers to the history of women philosophers that was published in 1690 by Gilles Menage. The book, however, often includes astronomers, male philosophers. It was therefore decisive for Agnesi. Therefore, she doesn't just go through. She also claims that list is only partially capturing reality. And instead, she demands an even higher place for women, one of complete equality, which they've earned through historically achieving the highest praise in intellectual disciplines. Just like in her juvenile oration, then, what she does is she's comparing ancient times and present times, praising the equality displayed in earlier ages. So turning the table on sexist opposition, who would use the ancient comparison to claim that women were not ever allowed. Again, if you read this text with the eye for it, you can find again that Cartesian element. When she's saying the weaker sex, she's clearly kind of saying, the weaker only applies to the body, but the minds of women were prepared by nature for teaching and erudition. So let me now move to the third text, the Flattering Famine. In this section, I move to the analysis of the third and last text, the dedication of Agnesi's analytical institution. So let me talk for a second about what this book is. It was published in 1748 when the author was 30. And it's a 2-volume textbook that was the first of its kind in Italian. So she switches from Latin, which she's used so far, and she goes into the vernacular. And it's Agnesi's masterpiece. The book had a significant impact with the public, to the point that it was used as the calculus manual late in the 1800s. And one of the most interesting criticisms that were kind of like given to her through peer review in letters was that, yes, the content was very innovative. The theses were amazing, but she was using Cartesian language and Cartesian mathematics in order to get to calculus, through mostly Leibnizian, not Newtonian calculus. What I consider this, what I think of this is that this actually proves to us that she was more attracted towards the more purely philosophical treatment of calculus, that is what you get if you get into calculus through Descartes. So this book also earned her significant praise and the recommendation from the Pope himself. I think it was Benedict 14th, for a professorship. She was the first woman who was advised for a professorship at the University of Bologna. However, she turned it down. And as I said, retired to private life and went on becoming a woman of service in a convent. However, as I've said, I will not be discussing much of the mathematical context today. I will focus on the preface, the dedication, which is, as I said, addressed to Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria. So the dedication opens with Agnesi expressing hope that Maria Theresa would accept the offer of the volumes. Sharing her gender with so great a sovereign, Agnesi says, has supported me in all my labors and made me insensible to the dangers that threaten my enterprise. The dangers are indeed connected with sexism and oppression, and they are dispelled by the fact that a woman sits on the throne of Vienna with universal praise and admiration. To the favorable circumstance of having Maria Theresa on the throne, Agnesi says, women can aspire to personal distinction in the arts and the sciences. What is more, their distinction becomes, in the word of Agnesi, a duty towards other women. Every woman should endeavor to promote the glory of her sex, and each, in accordance to her possibilities, contribute to increase its splendor. So she emphasizes this theme of solidarity among women, which is necessary for unhinging prejudice, which is pretty rare at this stage in what I call proto-feminism. This will become something much more emphasized in the works of people like Wollstonecraft later on. But at this time, in the mid 18th century, it's pretty rare to have this kind of class consciousness displayed. And the same conviction is implicit in the rest of the dedication, where Agnesi continues to praise the sovereign. So she says, "You, Maria Teresa, force all men to say of you what had not been said with greater reason of the ancient Caesars, that by justice and clemency of your government, you honor human nature and represent the divine. I leave to the women who will, zealous towards our sex, preserve your deeds for posterity, to describe how perfectly you accompany the strength of your intellect with the gracefulness of your body, and even more, each and every virtue." Again, we can observe Agnesi's call for gender camaraderie that emphasizes the zeal, it's a very strong word, required of all women in order to overcome prejudice. Notably, the zeal is expressed in the preservation for posterity of the merits of the Empress. So we find again the historical theme that she had been so keen on in earlier works. And this testifies how recurrent this theme is in her feminist production. And to my eye, it indicates an interest towards building a case for female equality based on factual evidence, right? There's this idea that if we write it all down, if we keep testimony of how great women behave in history, we can then just use that to crack the case of oppressive people. Furthermore, Agnesi continues to position herself as an adversary for sexist and biased men, not just the language here, men who need to be forced into admitting the greatness of a female sovereign. She has in her mind that there is this necessity to force them, that they wouldn't naturally just recognize the greatness. So in concluding the dedication, Agnesi stresses how the Empress herself was once devoted to studying arts and humanities before being, in her words, distracted by the business of running an empire, and how her mind knew each science to the point that Maria Teresa was considered the most learned of our century. And here, I would like to point out that the English translation of this work, made by a man, John Colson, she doesn't, in Italian, she clearly says the most learned person of our century. But in the English translation, Colson writes the most learned woman of this century. So I would like to point that out, because when this text was originally making its rounds around Europe, perhaps this feminist, overtone wasn't as clear. Finally, the dedication closes with a comparison of Maria Teresa to the other heroines who have reigned elsewhere, stressing more the role played by women in history. As we can see, both the text of this dedication and the prolegomena of the propositions are completely empty of this idea of women as companions for man, which we had seen in the earlier text. And in fact, it wants to recognize them as peers or even leaders in this last text. So this is what I meant to emphasize as the evolution of Agnesi's feminist thought. The dedication, as we've seen, is more than just the ritual and traditional offering of a scientific or philosophical work to a sovereign with all the, praise that goes with it. It presents all the elements highlighted in Agnesi's previous feminist works: the polemic against the sexist oppressors, the emphasis on the equality of men's and women's minds, and the keen interest towards historical themes. What it does, though, it adds the very interesting theme of women's solidarity and gender camaraderie, which becomes a call of duty for her peers. Thank you so much for having me, and that's what I have.